We've talked a lot about this plan design committee, right? And you suggested that there's some changes that need to be made, and the governance structure of it, 6-6. How many proposals have actually been put up for a vote that have resulted in a 6-6 tie?
We can get you that number. I don't know it offhand.
You got somebody there, don't you? Does she know?
I don't think we have the calculation of the exact number of proposals, but we're happy to get it for you.
Do you know of any time where it's resulted in a 6-6 tie?
Hi, Assemblyman.
Hello.
As the treasurer said, we don't have the exact number. I can tell you there have been many times. And we have been, through operation of statute, put into what is called super conciliation process, which is the non-binding arbitration process, multiple times over multiple deadlocked resolutions.
So have there been deadlock resolutions to reduce the number of plan options?
I don't recall.
Have
That's a good suggestion, though.
I appreciate that, but so you don't know if that suggestion has ever been put up for a vote?
It's been discussed. I can't recall if it's been put up for a vote. I'll
How
get back to you.
about increasing premium costs, premium shares by employees? Has that ever been put up for a vote?
So the Plan Design Committee does not have authority over premium contribution amounts.
Okay. So what about benefits that are available?
Many
In years
times.
past, people have talked about, I think last year and the year before, it was all about the GLP-1s and everybody taking these shots.
Right.
Has that been put up for a vote?
There have been discussions around GLP-1s. There were resolutions passed to increase copays on GLP-1s. So far, there have been no resolutions formally introduced that would restrict coverage of GLP-1s. There have just been internal discussions about the
So
possibility.
aside from the governance issue, forcing this logjam and not potentially realizing benefits and savings, you guys haven't put anything up to bring about savings? Is that what I'm
We have
understanding?
put many proposals on the table that have been deadlocked.
That have resulted in a deadlock vote?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. Treasurer?
One other comment on
Yeah,
that too, on
sure.
the GLP-1, the change
Yeah,
that
I mean,
was.
it's just one thing everybody
Yeah,
talks
no,
about.
it's a good, I mean, that's one of the cost drivers we're dealing with, but those copays were a result of the negotiation as a result of budget language that was put in by this legislature. So the legislature kind of drove that
Okay.
to get to the table, and that's how that happened, basically.
So I didn't see in the report that just came out last week or 2 weeks ago, what is the IBNR for the State Health Benefit Fund? Do you know? Like the incurred but not realized, like the actual losses that determine how much the premiums have to go up to close these holes in funding the program?
Heard but not paid.
Yeah.
Roughly, and these are ballpark
Sure.
estimates because I don't
Yeah,
have
yeah,
the
yeah,
exact figures, but you're looking at approximately 200 million for each of the plans, and the levels vary depending on the group that we're referring to.
200 million. So that is obviously a factor in determining the premiums that go forward.
Yes.
Right? So would the 600 million in Horizon monies that the previous administration and this legislature last year let lapse into the general fund, would that have been able to help offset the IBNRs, thus potentially reducing the impact of these premium increases?
That funding is ultimately used for Medicaid costs, but presumably it could have, with an act of the legislature, it could have been used for health benefit costs.
It could have, right?
It
Okay.
could have.
As was the intended purpose of that monies, correct? When we allowed Horizon to
I don't remember the exact
privatize or
language.
whatever. Wasn't it to help defray costs?
It was healthcare related, so it did end up in Medicaid, so it ended up
Yeah,
in
yeah, I
healthcare
understand.
related. So I'm not sure it could, but I think state health benefit plans could have been one of the eligible costs for that money.
Okay, great, thank you. Treasurer, in your remarks, you mentioned on page 2, you said the debt service for FY '27 includes over $500 million for repayment of the pension bonds issued in 1997. So is the $500 million the full debt payment or just on the Whitman bonding?
It's just on the pension.
Just on
Whitman
the pension
bonds.
bond.
It's 500 a year for, yeah.
But it would have been 500 million this year, correct? Or it is 500
It
million.
is 500
Sorry,
million,
it
yes.
is 500 million this year. In last year's budget, which you referred to towards the end of your remarks about one-shot revenues utilized in FY '26, such as the $555 million transfer from debt defeasance. Was that a Governor Murphy proposal in his proposed budget, or was that enacted by the legislature?
It was in the governor's budget message originally, and then it was increased in the later stages of the budget process.
How much was in the governor's proposal? 250. 250.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So it was proposed by Governor Murphy to take that money out, which could have been used for this, which was intended presumably to be used for payments like this, correct?
Yeah, it could have been used to pay down and debt.
Okay.
Debt payment.
And you mentioned you talked a lot about today the structural deficit. You made a comment, you said that 3 years ago, the structural deficit was 0 when Governor Murphy proposed his budget. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
So that was FY what?
I believe it was FY '24. We'll pull the number. At the GBM, it was a positive. It was a structural surplus.
It was a structural surplus. And one of the things that was talked about was certain cost drivers outside of just appropriations acts, right? Whether that be inflation, things of that nature. So was that taken into account in this year's budget? You mentioned before the contractual obligations, increased benefits for Medicaid
Yes.
this year, so on and so forth.
Yeah, so this budget includes significant cost drivers built into this budget right now, whether it's Medicaid, almost 800 million, school funding, almost 400 million, health benefits, contractual salary increases, property tax relief. They're all built, those increases are built in, which was why then you take back $2 billion in cuts and you add $750 million in revenue. That's how we're able to get from a $3 billion structural deficit down to a 1.6 structural deficit.
So presumably that year it was the same scenario, right? There were certain cost drivers baked in, so on and so forth.
Correct.
So how did Governor Murphy come up with a budget that didn't have a structural deficit, and Governor Sherrill's budget has a $1.5 billion structural deficit?
That was really the tail end of significant revenue increases coming through from the post-COVID time.
Okay, but now you don't have those revenue increases, right?
And that, exactly. So now that's why we're building towards getting to a 0 structural deficit again.
So you're saying that next year is going to be a 0 structure?
The goal is to continue this path and get to a 0 structural deficit
When?
as soon as we can. But
Is that next year? Is that
It's gonna
the year
depend
after?
partly
Is that
on the-
re-election year? Is that
the work we
presidential
do
election
together.
year? What is it?
the work we do together and this committee with us working together, we hopefully,
So let's say this legislature does nothing to what you proposed, right? And it adopts it as it is. When do we get to a 0 structural deficit?
right now it's the FY '27 proposal, which cuts the structural deficit in half. We would hope that we continue that progress and get there, ideally the next year, but, there's a lot of variables that come into play. When you look at economic uncertainty, worldwide uncertainty, as we talked about in the revenue forecast, we have serious concerns about hitting our targets for next year. And, the spending side, we have some control over, although not a ton of control over. We have a lot of control over. Revenue side is we have a lot of uncertainty right now.
But we also have a significant amount of control over that too, don't we? The revenue side?
Hitting our targets, we saw with the corporate business tax this past year, that was an unexpected significant drop between 5 to 800 million tied to federal changes that happened pretty quickly that were unanticipated, happened after the fiscal year started. So the revenue side, it's hard to predict.
So then does this budget, you're saying hopefully next year, maybe the year after, how do we get there? How do we get to an actual $0 structural deficit?
Part of the goal part of the work we need to do is continue to find ways to reduce costs, run government more effectively, better use technology. I think we're looking at $2 billion in cuts in this budget. I think continue to do a better job enforcing our existing tax structure. I think the division taxation is going to continue to do their work there. So I think, a lot of this is also building the economy, continuing to support businesses, continuing to ensure we do hit our revenue targets.
So how do you get to a 0 structural deficit if you don't impose spending limits on your departments?
I mean, so some of this, the limits can be a challenge because, for example, DHS,
That's Medicaid, forget that.
That's a
Let's put that
massive-
aside. You got a bunch of other departments other
But
than
again,
just
like
DHS.
The point was just raised a minute ago, though. The total cost of executive operations is $5 billion. So if we went in next year and said, we're going to cap, we want a 10% cut in all executive operations, that saves us $500 million. That doesn't close our structural deficit, but it does, would have massive impact on state services. So as we look to limit the structural deficit, we also want to continue to delivering high quality services. When people
So
call the
why
anchor
wasn't-
phone lines, they want to
So
be.
then, why wasn't that conversation had this year? Instead of 10%, 5%
That
savings?
conversation absolutely was had. In the 5 weeks we had to put this budget together, we looked for every possible cut. We pushed departments who are
But
collaborating with this.
Hold on, you said, find it if you can find it. Nobody
no.
was given a number. Why was there not a decision made to say, find 5%, find 1%?
Because we were looking for more
I
than
mean, do they,
5%
I
in
mean, it's like,
places.
do you really need to order the same number of Post-its this year that you did last year?
I would
Was there
suggest
any
$2
discussion
billion
like
in cuts was a significant, as you've heard in your public hearings, like, these are serious, deep cuts that you're facing.
No, no,
we're
I'm talking
facing.
about operational cuts. I'm not talking about CASA and, battered women's shelters and Winona Lipman. I'm not talking about those cuts. I'm talking about, you said $5 billion is the executive function, right? So how come no conversation was had to say find 1% savings in that $5 billion?
But Assemblyman, whether it's 1% for one department, or maybe for some departments it might be more, I think that's where the treasurer was saying that they found $2 billion, right? So whether it could be one for one department, I think,
But no, hold on. I'm asking on the operation side. I understand what you're saying, Madam
Yeah,
Chair.
but
the
I
2 billion
think-
savings wasn't necessarily on the executive operation side, unless you're going to tell me cutting Winona Lipman is an executive function.
well, I would agree with you there, but
That's why I use that one.
I know, thank you, Essex County. But I also want to say, you could correct me if I'm wrong, Treasurer, I think what you were saying is, without cutting services, right, from the departments, and especially the 5 weeks that you had to prepare, I think you found savings without cutting services because you had new commissioners come on board. So I don't know if
But
this year,
my
I get
question
what you're
is-
saying, and
We-
I like your pathway, because I think that should definitely probably be a conversation for the next budget cycle, or maybe in between now to when the budget is ready, they can come up. The executive also has a chance to come to the table with other offerings as well.
But the concern I have, Madam Chair, is that what I'm asking for is, instead of cutting programs and services to realize $2 billion, how come a conversation, or was a conversation had, to say, find 1% in your actual executive operations?
We absolutely,
Fair.
in it,
Fair.
Thank you.
Don't,
yeah, I mean.
it happens once.
I know, this is my one.
Assemblyman.
This is my one today.
I mean, we worked with departments to look for cuts everywhere possible. I would also say, if this committee, which does a lot of work here in this budget, comes up with additional ideas for cuts, we're open to those, and we would encourage those.
So, okay, two last things. In a couple of questions asked by Assemblyman Rumpf, he was referring to, I think, what the governor said in her budget address, which was, if you want to spend more, fine, but find the cuts, right? I think it was something like, if you want to add, then find the subtraction, right? I think she said it was simple math, plus minus still has to equal 0, I believe is what her point was. Is that what you take it as?
That, absolutely, her goal is to work with legislative leadership to find cuts to offset spending increases that happen at the
So
later stages
are
of the
we
budget.
to then surmise from her statement that she does not want the final Appropriations Act to exceed $60.7 billion?
We know that the final product of this budget process the Appropriations Act that we put forward, you put forward, will be a collaboration between
No,
legislative
no, that's not,
leadership.
I understand that. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, Mr. Treasurer, are we to surmise that the governor's point of saying, if you want to add, then you got to subtract, because it's simple math, means she does not want this budget that is delivered to her, hopefully before June 30th, to exceed $60.7 billion? What it looks like inside,
Yeah,
I'm
I
not
would-
talking about.
Yeah, I mean, a lot can happen between now and then in terms of additional costs that come up, right? Like, there are absolutely, we have supplemental spending, there are bills that get passed. Like, the goal, though, is to find cuts. So that is, continues to be the goal, to find ways to reduce costs to offset increases.
So keep it at 60.7?
I think that the treasurer's trying to answer your question without pinpointing a number, because ultimately.
Without answering it?
No, I think ultimately, he has a large say in what that number is going to look like, because between talking to rating agencies, between looking at what's coming along what's from when the budget first was introduced to now, even through June, there could be other changes or unforeseen things. But I think that it's not the treasurer's say, really, in what the ultimate number is going to stay at.
So the math isn't that simple?
Correct.
Okay. And one last question. This is not for me. I'm asking for a friend. When you do your taxes, is housing provided by your employer a taxable benefit?
We may need to get back to you on that one.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate it. That's all I have.